Welcome to Brewers Live, proudly brought to you by Benspoke Brewing Co. This is edition number 10 tonight, and really special night tonight. We're going to talk to some of the great Australian beer writers that their job is to talk about beer all the time. So that's what our main topic is tonight. A little bit of housekeeping. Make sure you throw us your question. Best question will get a merch pack, and best champion question at the end of the year or whenever we stop, it's going to win a Benspoke beer experience. I just made that up on the spot, and that's great. First of all, I'd also like to talk about these little things, these little 360-degree lids. So, welcome to the show. Welcome to Brewers Live, proudly brought to you by Benspoke Brewing Co. Here tonight, we're talking to the beer writers, the best beer writers in Australia. It's all about those people who talk about beer. It's their job to talk about beer every day. I'm sure that includes a few tastes along the way as well. First of all, we might get into a little bit of housekeeping. Throw in your question. Best question tonight wins a merch pack. Best question over the course of the year will win a Benspoke beer experience. I did just make that up, but I think that's very rewarding for somebody to put in their question and get chosen as best question. I also want to talk about these things, these little 360-degree lids. We can't get them anymore, and we're not allowed to use them in New South Wales from May 21 next year. So a little bit of feedback to everyone out there who's been asking us why we changed our can lid and why the beer's changed. Well, the beer definitely hasn't changed. We haven't changed the crankshaft recipe from right back in the day when we first brewed that first crankshaft in the brew pub in 2014. It was actually on May the 8th, 2014, just under a month before we actually opened our brew pub. But the beer does, the appreciation of this beer out of the two different cans is different. It's a matter of you can't see the beer, you can't smell the beer, and even drinking the beer out of a normal can is somewhat, for me, less less welcoming. You don't get all those beautiful flavours that you do get out of a 360-degree can. Unfortunately, we're trying really hard to come up with our own take on our can lid, and that's something we're working on, and hopefully we can have our own lid at some point that complies with all these lovely regulations we've got around Australia. Can you believe each state has its own CDS scheme that has its own different set of rules, and as a manufacturer that distributes their beer all around Australia, but through all these states, we have to abide by all these different rules in every state. So it makes it really hard to service people around Australia evenly. Anyway, let's keep moving forward. I remember when I first started out in beer, one of the first people I met way back in the day was a guy called Willie Simpson. He was one of the first people that I related to in terms of writing about beer. I do want to go a little bit further back than that too, because there was a grand old master of beer writing who heralded from the UK called Michael Jackson, and he was one of the first people really around the world to write about beer. I was lucky enough to meet Michael. He came to the Wigan Pen some years ago now, probably 98 I think, around that time, and he was such a warm, knowledgeable guy about all things beer. He had so many great beer experiences, and he was somebody that was spreading the word about really good beer and really different beer. I think partially Willie Simpson had already started his career by then, but certainly he was inspired by Michael Jackson, and Willie Simpson did a lot for beer writing, especially in the early times in Australia when there was really not a lot of breweries around. I guess if we leapfrog through now to more modern times, and there's a number of really great beer writers, people who are talking about beer all around Australia. We're lucky enough to have two of those on the show. Unfortunately, we couldn't get all 82 of them, but we got two of them on the show tonight. We've got Matt Kirkgard from Brews News and James Smith from Crafty Pint. Welcome, guys, to the show.
Thank you very much, Rich. And can I actually just sort of say, to hear you talk about someone like Willie Simpson, who basically inspired me and showed me that you could write about beer, and also Michael Jackson, talking about giving a guy a huge case of imposter syndrome, when you talk about those guys, because I still don't think Australia has had a beer writer of the match of Willie.
Yeah, look, he was very special in a very tough time, and it'd be great to see him do come out of retirement, so to speak, and maybe take you guys on head to head now and see what he could churn out. He always had a special way of doing things, but always been able to articulate his points and really talk positively about beer.
So he's looking to sort of hang up his brewing paddle, isn't he, and just focus on mead and kayaking or something. So he might have a bit more time for that.
Yeah, I think he might have even got into fishing and a bit of smoking potentially too. So hopefully Willie maybe tuned in tonight, not sure, but hope he's doing well. We might start out, guys, by understanding how you guys got into beer. James, how did you end up getting into beer? What was your path?
In terms of, I guess, the recent path, as in what I'm doing now, moved to Australia 12 years ago as a journo and thought, I'll try and pick up some work at the Age or what have you. Started pitching left, right, and centre, and it was a slow process. There's not a lot of print media has been in free fall for a long time, and it was an even smaller market here in the UK. And then very early on, my wife had some teaching, like temporary teaching, with this woman who turned out to be now Tom Delmont of Fixation's wife. So within a few weeks of getting there, we went and stood on a street corner outside the old legendary Greyhound Hotel in St Kilda, cold, wet Melbourne May evening, I think it was. Got into the car with these people I'd never met before, and we were taking them to Mountain Goat, and it was just like, I did not expect to find this in Australia. I'd been here maybe 10 years earlier, and towards the end discovered Coopers, but moved over here thinking I was almost giving up that sort of beer culture of real ales that I've been drinking back home. And then very quickly from that, I think it was a case of meeting people from other breweries. I started playing for the Mountain Goat indoor cricket team, and then you sort of jump online, and there wasn't too much up-to-date information there. I think John Stallwood had his website that was sort of on pause, microbrewing.com.au. There's a bit of stuff from Willie, and yeah, it just sort of went from there. I guess I had a desire, I had a need to find something to write about. I had an interest in beer. It was in some ways sparked because the information wasn't always correct or wasn't up to date. And this was 2008, 2009, so it was, I reckon that was the time things were really starting to bubble. Certainly around Victoria, there were a lot of regional breweries in nice areas, so wherever we went on holiday, there was always somewhere to go and visit. But I look back and think I'd always drunk real ale since I started drinking. I'd lived in Germany for a brief period of time, and had Hefeweizen and what have you. So I think I innately was drawn towards traditional, whatever the traditional beer was, wherever I was. But it was, I think it was at that time there was something really bubbling here, and that sort of, I probably just got swept up in that as much as anything. And I think I must have had a pitch to Epicure that was accepted about Brewers getting into beer or whatever, and then that led to a second story, and then and then I think Cam from Mountain Goat put me in touch with you. I think Matt, because
I think Ben Krause might have even been the guy that introduced us.
Okay.
So
because I think you were about to launch Brews News, and I'd been sort of working on this idea of what became Crafty Pint. And there's a few people I've spoken to, like Cam and David Mountain Goat, to pick their brains, Stephen Guy at the Tap House, just people who you could see with sort of totems in the industry. And yeah, someone put me in touch with Matt and said, "You should speak to this guy. He's sounds like you're doing pretty much the same thing." And we ended both of us 2010, wasn't it, that we sort of pushed live.
Dinner at Scales and Ales and talked about, well, should we come together and do the same thing? But we both had slightly different visions of where we saw our sites going. I think I'd launched by that stage because we suck in the business side of things so badly that our 10-year anniversary was back in January. And we didn't even celebrate it. I think that we both wanted to do something slightly differently, and I think we both got very strong views of these things, and so we found these complementary niches in the industry.
Yeah, but it's funny because there was also, I think, a lot of people. Blogging was, it wasn't blogging in its infancy, but there's a lot of people launching beer blogs of various, kinds of at the time. Most of which, were maybe fairly short-lived. Certainly, the thing we've been going up, Crafty will be 10 years soon as well. Sometimes it feels like longer, sometimes it doesn't feel like that long at all, but, I think that's one of the things that we've had with Matt and I is longevity somehow. You know, we've sort of, you know, maybe had a clearer vision throughout what we wanted to do, rather than just writing occasional opinion pieces or talking about places we've been to. Yeah, it's weird to think it's been 10 years now for both of us.
Yeah, right. And Matt, was yours a similar journey, or did you come through a different path?
Mate, it's funny because like I'm kind of like the guy that was wearing UGG boots or flares when they were unfashionable, and suddenly flares came back into fashion. Everyone sort of said that guy knows fashion. My very first job was in the very early '90s as a law clerk, and because I wanted to originally be a lawyer, and so consequently I was out with a lot of barristers, being invited out to lunch and dinner, and they were world class. Hopefully none of them are watching. World class wine wankers, and you'd go out and they would fuss about wine so much, and some of them knew some stuff about it, and they would tell the stories, and the stories about wine were so incredibly engaging, but I found the pretense about it just so off-putting, and I just I could I found wines that I liked, but you just sort of heard all of the garbage that went alongside it, and I loved beer, and so a little bit later I started, as with a lot of people, discovered German wheat beers or Belgian wheat beers or sort of Belgian brown ales, or Flanders Reds that we talked about recently. And I wondered why they were different from what we had in Australia, which was pretty much a monoculture of pale lager. And I started, having heard all of these stories about wine, I just started asking, why? Why does this beer taste like it does? Why does this beer? In those days there wasn't the internet. There was Willie Simpson's book, and I think behind me there'll be a copy of it, which was Willie's Amber and Black, I think it was called. And I think that was one of the first beer books I bought, there wasn't much. And I discovered that there was this story behind beer that no one was telling. And gradually I ended up leaving law and going into journalism. And no one was telling the story. Every magazine had a wine writer, and having discovered beer, no one was telling the stories of beer, apart from Willie in the Sydney Morning Herald. And so I just started pitching articles about beer because you didn't have blogs in those days, and started getting published, and ended up editing Australia's beer magazine. And then we can probably talk a little bit about that, but I just happened to be writing about beer when blogging. Suddenly there were these things called blogs, and all this stuff that you couldn't place in the media, you could start blogging. So, around about 2002, 2003, I started blogging, and initially, that was how I met Pete Mitchell, who was my co-host of the podcast, and we, he would read my stuff, I would read his stuff, and then suddenly this audience started growing. So it was really, I was just the guy who all of my friends were into wine, and I was just so unfashionable that it kind of worked out for me.
Yeah, there you go. I might just make a quick shout out. I did forget somebody earlier, Chris Shanahan, who started writing about beer in Canberra, probably 94, 95. He was writing about beer right through to the late O's. So another early beer writer. I mean, we're talking about writing, but you guys obviously do a lot of talking. Do you feel like you do more writing than talking, or talking than writing at the moment?
Well, I don't write much anymore. I don't know about James, but that's the funny thing, very much what James and I do is very much like craft breweries. We basically started, killing ourselves by doing everything ourselves, and then it's just unsustainable. And as you grow, you start getting people to do things. So, and we've got the Radio Brews News podcast, Pete and I. So I tend to do a lot more talking than writing these days. How about you, James?
Um, I've been doing a lot more writing since COVID hit.
Yep.
We had to, make a few tighten some belts, and so a lot more stuff's come back onto me on that front, which is, it's good. I enjoy. I've always done an article for the Halliday magazine every edition since they've come out, so that sort of kept things ticking over. But I know I do have this dream that I'd like to get back to the point where I am writing more regularly, because I do enjoy getting my teeth really into something, and every now and then when you get your teeth in something, you're like, oh, I can actually write, but you forget because you spend the whole time doing all the other stuff that has to be done in running, which effectively is a business. It was probably a few years ago that I started thinking, shit, this is actually a business now. I guess it always was to an extent, but, thinking I've got two people that rely on me for their living and other people who is part of their income, and I've got to think about this, and so all those things sort of become more time consuming, but for sure, ultimately, if I can make, first rescue the business post-COVID, but then, turn into a stronger business down the line, I'd love to be able to hand off some of this stuff that has to come through me, and, always have some fun projects or big projects to work on, because ultimately, that's what I got into it,
Yeah, because you like beer. Well, speaking of a big project, we've all got a big project on at the moment called COVID. How do you feel that's affected you, and how do you see it affecting the beer industry at the moment? Maybe start with you, Matt.
It's funny, I've had this conversation a few times recently, so hopefully no one that's listening has already heard me say this, but, I'm 50, and so, I remember my parents in the 70s, and then, my dad got retrenched in the 80s. He was a geologist, and then in the 90s, whenever you got in a cab, every cab driver was an architecture graduate or a geology graduate or one of those things, and interest rates coming down to 5 or 6% was a huge achievement. So I grew up, with interest rates seeing them peak at 17%. So in terms of me personally, I've always been mindful that the comparative good times that we've had economically are temporary. And so one of the reasons I did what I did and I shaped my business the way I shaped it was that I never wanted to, I wanted to feel that any day I could shut it down and move on and not owe anybody. So I never had a leverage or anything like that. So as James said, your business changes when you've got staff and you've got to, they're relying on you for their lifestyle. But everything else about my business was a little bit more, manageable. So, day one when COVID started becoming real, I just said to my staff, look, you guys don't have to worry about your jobs. I will guarantee your jobs. And that was, fortunately, the government came out with JobKeeper, which made that promise a little bit easier to keep. But we're here, we're still going. We've lost a little bit of skin on our knees, but we're still playing. And that's about as much as we can hope for. I really feel for brewers. Unlike brewers, I've got a laptop and some bandwidth and things like that. I don't have, $500,000 worth of stainless steel to service the debt on and a lease and those sorts of things. So,
yeah. And James, what do you reckon? How are you?
In terms of on a personal level, when it first became apparent what was coming, I think maybe a week before lockdown, or maybe 2 weeks before, we've been talking about doing some sort of story early on about the impact of COVID. But then it was like, is it going to affect supply lines from overseas? It was that kind of consideration. And then when it sort of became apparent how serious it was, I remember sort of thinking, the industry's going to be devastated by this. In some of the stories we were working on, it's like, what's the point? So I think the good thing for us was coming up with the idea for that campaign. That really gave us a purpose and some drive, and then obviously a lot of, I guess, stories to put out there. But then I think in terms of the industry, it's very hard to say. I think brewers in some ways aren't going to be affected as badly as a lot of venues. I think I do think in years to come we'll look back at this era in the last few months in Australian craft beer, and just think it was an incredible turnaround. Like what the industry did and what it achieved in a very short space of time was quite remarkable. And I don't know if many other industries actually changed the way they operated so successfully and so quickly. But I think as things start to open up with restrictions in place, unless we totally wipe it out over here and go back to a New Zealand situation, a lot of venues are going to find it unsustainable, especially restaurants. And I think that's where we'll see more damage. And then I guess that might become a slower impact on the brewing industry, an ongoing tale of lower demand. But at the same time, I think, I've had a few conversations with people who've got friends outside the beer industry. I don't seem to have any, who have just said, well, everyone that we know in hospitality and beer has been hit really hard. They're screwed, or they're not screwed, but they're having to fight back and readjust, all their business plans and everything. But if you're not in the beer industry, or in an impacted industry, you might just have been sat at home getting bored, but still getting paid and thinking, I can't afford to go on an expensive holiday. I've got money sloshing around in my bank account. So there's people out there with money who are bored, who you need to try and get to your brewery or need to entice to buy your beer. Like Guy, who writes for me a bit in WA, he was chatting to Joel from the Dutch Trading Co. And he says there's people coming in going, look, normally I'd be going out on the weekend and spending a couple of $100. I can't go out. I'm in the mood for a stout. And he'll go, oh, well, I've got this $80 barrel-aged imported stout. He goes, done, I'll take two. It's like, so yeah. There's positives out there for the businesses that are thinking smartly. But I think, Matt mentioned JobKeeper. That's, when that goes away, that's going to have a big impact, especially on, the venue-based side of things. We've, as from Crafty Pint, we're looking at that as sort of, we've got to fix certain things before that comes around, just from the, the drop-off in marketing budgets and yada, yada. But I don't know, it's provided we don't have too many hiccups like in Victoria this week, and people have been smart about changing their business, I think the beer industry might not be too bad. I worry more for, the hospo side of things, really.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Just a quick one. We had a few problems with the sound, so apologies for that, everyone. I think we're back on air and it's all been going pretty well. Matt, how are you finding it? What are you hearing from the breweries who have, up there in sunny Queensland about their experiences through COVID?
Look, everyone's playing a pretty straight bat when you ask them the question, but at the same time, I think a lot of that is the people that are actually doing reasonably well, and there are some that are probably have a bit of a feeling of surprise, and I've heard someone describe that almost as survivor guilt because they see how tough it is, and some breweries are doing okay, and they're probably the ones that had a very strong community around them or a very disciplined model. But then I think there are breweries that are doing it very, very hard, and no one wants to admit that. Mm. So, as I said, it's I won't say once in a generation or anything like that, but we haven't seen a situation like this strike a specific industry, hospitality, tourism, breweries, the way we are now. And I just can't imagine that anyone's not stressed. But there seem to be some that are doing well and some that are really doing it tough, and I really feel for them.
I think one of the things that has to be taken into consideration as well is that I think people felt the industry had been growing too fast, and there was all this talk, for 2 or 3 years ago, there's going to be some sort of rationalisation, businesses that haven't got their model right, or there was all that discussion anyway, and so throwing this hand grenade into the middle of a fairly potentially fragile situation is only going to exacerbate issues, you think, for businesses that weren't set up well or were struggling anyway. At the same time,
I've always said there's only two models that work. If you're really, really small and you have a brew pub, or you're really, really super big and you can make beer profitably enough to sell a keg. I think once you do one of those models, then you can do whatever other model you want. But you need one of those two models, and I think we're sort of seeing that those breweries that have set up in those ways are handling things potentially better than others.
Yeah.
I guess we move forward a little.
What about your thoughts? I mean, you said you've been really busy in the production brewery, but obviously, impacted on the venue side. But you've got more runs on the board in the industry than either me or Matt. So, what are your thoughts for the year ahead?
I think it's gonna be in waves. So we're in a good little spot at the moment. We're in a little trough, and that's really good. But then there's another wave coming through, and I think whatever you do, you've got to be set up for the next wave. We'll all go back into it at some point, and then we'll have another trough, and then we might have a wave come through that's not as big as the last one. But ultimately, we're really not going to be in a great position until there is a potential vaccination for this, are we? So, I mean, I don't think the world can exist in terms of trade without travel, and I think we're seeing a lot of cases come from people travelling, whether it's internally in Australia or coming in from outside. So I'm not sure how that's going to affect things. In terms of the brewing industry, I think people are drinking more beer at home, and they're drinking higher alcohol beers at home, and they're drinking different beers at home. So I think the breweries that can produce, those sort of beers are going to be able to, keep plodding forward. I mean, we were pretty lucky. We only had 25% of our volume in kegs, so we didn't have as much impact as other breweries that had much larger volume. The brew pub's certainly been great, certainly been decimated, but we were great in actually pivoting and adapting and going into takeaway sales, and ended up getting our beer. We used to have about 18 beers on tap, and we got 28, I think, at the moment. So we were putting out a lot of new beers, connecting with our membership, our drafters, and putting new beers out and getting more people into the pub, doing takeaway food, and now we're allowed to have people back in. It's just a case of trying to manage it. But we're only 25% capacity at 1 per 4 square metres, so unless they change to 1 per 2 square metres, unfortunately in Canberra everyone tried to do 1 per 2 square metres last weekend, so the government's pretty well thrown 1 per 2 square metres in the bin now for the next 4 weeks, and we'll be at 1 per 4 square metres for at least, I would reckon, 4 weeks now, because so many people acted irresponsibly last weekend, thinking that they need to try and catch up on their income in one weekend, and I think we had, in Little ACT, we had 800 offenders last year in the restaurant, pub, bar, club game over the weekend, which is 800 places. I don't even think I could name 800 places in the ACT, so it's a big number.
Yeah.
But what are you guys actually writing about at the moment, or what are you talking about at the moment? I'm sure you've had a fair bit to do with COVID, but let's, as much as COVID's real and live and it's with us at the moment, let's just put it to one side and talk about actually the beer part at the moment, and what is on everyone's, what's on the tip of everyone's tongue at the moment. What are you guys talking about?
Seltzer.
Seltzer.
Well, funnily enough, like, seltzer is actually a big thing at the moment, but it's more not so much the drink itself, but what it means for the industry. We looked at some stats today that came out of the US that I think Boston Beer Company, 13% of their volume over the last 4-week period was actually beer, and that included Dogfish Head, and that included Sam Adams, and more than half of the product was their seltzer, and then hard tea, and then they had twisted tea, and then something else. And that to me is fascinating from an industry point of view. What it means for brewers and businesses and how they grow and adapt. Because when, if you go back to when I first started writing about beer, craft beer wasn't even a thing. James talked about microbrewing.com, which was John Stallwood's site, because it was microbrewing. And Rich, you would have been a microbrewer. And now it's craft beer, and that created this thing that people could raise a flag and rally behind. And now breweries are becoming beverage companies. Whether they've got a cider or a ginger beer or a seltzer, And that is one of the things that is really preoccupying me at the moment. It's looking at that evolution of the industry.
Do you think people are going to rally behind the hard seltzer flag?
I don't know. I don't
Let's
think anyone
define.
gives
Maybe
not
let's
something that
define
you're
what
passionate,
seltzer is. What do you guys think seltzer is?
Seltzer is an RTD, and like if it's clear and you can tax it like beer, it's a seltzer. Otherwise, it's an RTD. It's a very simplistic definition, but it just shows that if you go back 10 or 15 years, we were passionate about craft beer and making everyone, bringing people on to the flavors of beer, because suddenly there was this huge palette of flavors of things that weren't your dad's or your granddad's lager. And there's something for everybody. And seltzers and ginger beers and ciders and the other things are almost a admission that, well, we're not going to bring everybody to beer, so how does our business keep growing? And to answer James's question, that's my biggest fear for the industry is you're not going to have the same passions about whether independence matters. You're not going to have an independent seltzer day the way that we have an independent beer day. And are we going to start bleeding around the edges?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost a symptom of it's a very different sector, and it's clearly money and market driven, in a greater way than. But if you talk about the question about what we're not so much writing about at the minute, we're trying to emerge from all the COVID coverage to get back to sort of other stories more on a greater percentage, but people trying new directions with beer, often quite, novelties like pastry stouts are a huge thing at the minute. And, I've had some that it might do what it says on the tin, but it's like, seriously, who actually really wants to drink that?
Hey, James, just very quickly, just to have a quick commercial break. If you want to learn more about that, listen to my discussion with Richard Watkins, who's a young brewer from Canberra, on Radio Brewers News this week, where we talk about exactly that issue. So anyway,
but you can actually have a good brewed beverage that is a beer. It fits all the beer definitions. Tastes a bit like beer, but is seltzer like. It's interesting that people have gone straight into seltzer instead of maybe bridging the gap a little bit and bringing people on a little bit of a journey into the brewery rather than into the sugar farm.
Well, I thought some of the kettle sours were doing, the fruited kettle sours were spanning that, but then it's only a very small step then into some of the seltzer markets. But, again, Rich, I guess anyone that's watching this would expect me to say this, but I've just cracked a tin of your phlegm, if you can sort of see that.
I better do the same.
It is, again, to me as a beer writer, it is the equivalent of a Shiraz, like a really, really good Shiraz. It's got all of the structure and the complexity and the ability to match with food and so much going on that it just excites me and, reinvigorates my passion every day when I try beers like that.
That's an excellent pivot away from hard seltzer there. Excellent work.
We've got a question up, actually. We've got a question in from Justin. And it's interesting when we talked about whether you guys like writing or talking, but you obviously have to taste a lot of beer and get given a lot of beers to taste. But do you like actually going into a brewery anonymously and trying their beers, or do you actually make a point of walking through the door, walking straight up to the bar and dropping a card and introducing yourself straight away, or what? Because I can tell you what used to happen.
It's a very great performer, and I think Matt's the same. Like, I try and get in somewhere, order what I can, whatever it is, and pay, and get away and hide away somewhere and sort of form an opinion or take everything in without being spotted. I think there was last time I was up in Brisbane. Actually, I tried that in one of the brew pubs. I won't name names, and I was thinking, this guy looked vaguely familiar. Anyway, wasn't saying anything, just asking questions about the venue, ordering a paddle of the beers and, whatever were their sort of, house favourites. And then And then as he was giving me this stuff tour, he goes, "So you're up for the awards tonight?" Then I was like, "Oh God!" He's no, I am the whole time. I am trying to sort of, go under the radar, and he's just been going, "Why has he not just said hello?" Like, we spoke briefly a year ago. So, but very, very much so, because I think A, you want to try and pay your way, and B, you want to try and get a vibe, at least from the staff who don't know you, and just sort of make an impression. Also, not make an impression, but gain your own impression, sort of in a neutral way, so to speak.
And Matt, are you aligned to that?
Oh, mate, I sneak in and sneak out. And it's as surprising as it might seem for somebody who sort of is willing to talk about beer. I joke that beer is my superpower. I'll talk about it all day. But outside of that, I'm very quiet, and I like to sort of sneak in and be very unassuming as much as possible, and also to understand a venue and understand a beer. You don't want to have the royal tour, or you don't want to be treated differently. You want to see how a venue operates, and you want to do that as anonymously as you can.
Yeah. And I think then it's all well and good to then go and ask for the boss and introduce yourself and find out a bit more. But I think I don't think the industry is that much of an industry where people will really treat you that differently or put on a show. But there's always going to be a little element of that. It's funny. I mean, you probably find this as well, Matt. I think we're pretty straightforward and pretty upfront people, and yet there are still some people who think, "Oh, you're the media. You either need to be wowed or you're out to get me." You know what I mean? And it's like, it's just. I guess the wider media asked for that sort of impression.
David's put up another good question too that sort of relates to this. Seeing more press releases than anyone in Australia, can you predict what the top trends are for summer?
Seltzer.
Seltzer. And just going back to what you're saying about the seltzer before, so many of the kettle sours or just sour pitch sours that are kept very light on the lacto character, very light on the acid, and high on and fruit forward. They are so similar.
Yeah.
And and the only thing that can be driving people to do seltzer is the name seltzer, is because they're looking at what's happening in America and going, it's selling fucking gazillions of liters. Therefore, it's just like, people can't sell a saison, but you call it a farmhouse ale and you can sell a saison. And years ago, back in the early days of me doing crafty pint, people saying you can't sell a porter, but call it a stout and you can sell it. So, that was on a small scale. And I think that's what it is. People are like seltzers. To some people must sound like a license to print money.
It's not going to be long, and the industry is going to be. There used to be ale and lager, and it's going to be IPA and seltzer. So everything's either an IPA in some form, or everything's going to be a seltzer in some form, and they're just marketing terms.
Yeah, well, IPA covers so many bases now. I was writing up a few new beers from Ravens this morning, and one of them is their latest shake series, which milkshake IPAs, and so it's creme brulee, and they have put a lot of hops in there. But even in their notes they send out, I'm assuming to venues or whatever, it says, and then we triple dry hopped with some pretty big hops, big in character hops. He goes, just so we can still say it's an IPA. They see the humour in it themselves, because it's a big, sweet, creamy, vanilla-y, custardy, caramelly beer with a little bit of hop character. And they see it for what it is, but it's just, and it's all happened so fast, really. I mean, how many years ago was it that you did that interview on Brews News with the guy at CUB saying IPAs will never take off? Nobody wants to drink a 6% 60 IBU beer. That is never going to happen.
But in his defence, no, it wasn't even that long ago. But in his defence, he was right in a way, because he didn't, IPAs are huge in a very, very, they're a whale in a fish pond. Yeah. In so many ways, they still haven't broken out. And I mean, I think the evolution of the New England IPA and all of the variations that have come from that are because people didn't like the bitterness of IPAs, and so they became juicy to take the bitterness out. That made it much more approachable. But in their own way, they're a very, very small thing. So, I I would never criticise him for saying that, because I think the insight that he had was that their IPAs are never going to scale.
Mm-hmm.
But as a brewery that is probably one of the only breweries in Australia that actually has their flagship beer as an IPA, I think IPA is something that is now part of our beer culture, really, worldwide.
Congratulations on it too. Like, that was my having that in Brisbane and having it taste so fresh. Congratulations.
Yeah, well, that's good that it's travelled that well. Thanks, Matt.
I bought that at a bottle shop, but you didn't send it to me either, so it was actually through trade.
Is it when you say it's your flagship beer? Is it your biggest seller as well, the Crankshaft?
Yeah, absolutely it is. Barley Griffin not too far behind, but certainly, Crankshaft is our biggest selling beer, and the one that certainly we see the most growth in at the moment as well. Certainly in these times when people are prepared to spend a little bit more money and try something a bit different and go down a different experience route.
And what's your feedback, either from Bent's boat perspective, or you invite journalists on, you're in trouble, we're going to start throwing questions back.
Well, I'm consciously not asking questions because I figure that we're in the hot seat.
Oh, but I just think, because all the noises around, whether it's around seltzer at one end or around pastry stouts or all the more sort of esoteric stuff, but from my understanding is, people are still buying in within the independent craft sector, pale ales, Pacific ales, golden ales, IPA, coming up into fourth place or whatever. Is that still very much your reading of the market, that, you're still putting out your Imperial Stout and, the Phlegm and stuff like that, but is it very much, if you want to be a bigger brewery, you've got to have a good IPA and a good pale and a good sort of session pale?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think at the end of the day, they're the big market segments, and they're what a lot of bottle shops want to see on the shelves. So I think, yes, you do need to have those categories, but you also need to be creative and innovative as well at the same time. And, push the boundaries, but try different things. And as much as I understand why people are making a seltzer, it doesn't sit right. It just doesn't sit right for me. And I still think there's beer alternatives that could do the same, fill the same role or fill the same gap as what a seltzer is.
So you don't think my website, the Spritzy Seltzer, is going to fly?
But Richard, that's why I love having you on our podcast, Richard, because you always say things like that, which no one wants to say. I'm not going to yuck anyone's yum. If they like them, go for it. We drink for the pleasure that brings us. But I'm ultimately with you. I sort of think it's if we're in the brewing industry, we try and bring people to beer in its many and varied forms. Otherwise, we're basically in we're a beverage business, and no one is going to die in a ditch over an independent beverage business.
Yeah,
that's interesting. I think you talk about sort of moving from bitter IPAs to juicy IPAs and how they help bring some people into beer or into the IPA world, because they were just fruit juice more than as much as anything in character. And I think you can bring people into beer with low acid fruit sours, but I don't see how you're going to bring someone into beer with seltzer. Like, it's just so far removed. Like,
yeah,
it's not.
That's right. And I think you've got to be, we're in a different, not a different position to every brewery, but we're fairly young, just over 6 years old. We've only been doing wholesale for 5 years, so we've still got a lot of growth in what we do best, and that is make hop forward beers. So I don't want to start going too far off field or offline with having seltzers and all other sorts of things, because we still need to leverage what we do best. I don't really want to reinvent ourselves either and end up with a brand that's built around fruit options. We're not a fruit company, we're a beer company. So I think that's important for us to, well, that's the way I'm looking at it at the moment. I think we've got lots to do with what we do best, and I think we should stick to that. And I think that's what I think a lot of people should do. I think if maybe you're a bit older, or what you've tried to do isn't quite working, then certainly leveraging into seltzer could go really well. But at the moment, it's not for me. Look, we established pretty early on that you guys do a lot of talking and not a lot of writing. Have there been opportunities where you haven't been able to, your tongue's been tied and you haven't been able to answer someone's question, or you haven't been able to talk about something that you were about to talk about?
Based on the conversation so far, what do you think?
I think for me, I think early on in getting involved in doing what I'm doing now, because when I became a journalist, I very much wanted to be a print journalist, because you didn't have to speak live, you didn't have to appear anywhere, you were just, a name on a piece of paper, and when your name's James Smith, you can't be much more anonymous than that. And so when I got involved in doing this over here, it became apparent quite early on in doing the beer writing and Crafty Pint that there was more event-based stuff that was going to happen, and I hated any public speaking. I was always very shy, believe it or not, and so the thought of having to do any hosting or be part of anything would terrify me, and I'd sort of have to try and think everything through. What questions might there be? What would the answers be? Like, overthink everything. And then I think I realised reasonably early on, the more you do it, you sort of get used to it. But also, because you're the journalist, you're generally, or the host, you're generally the host who's there just to ask questions and facilitate other people's stories. So it doesn't matter, you're subsidiary to the whole thing. You're actually there just to keep things flowing. And once I'd sort of got to that point, it was pretty easy. I don't know. I don't sort of have any qualms about any situation now, really. You can be put up for anything and just sort of walks on and go, this will be fine. But it was certainly a very different 10, 11 years ago. I used to hate the thought of any public speaking, any, live interaction completely.
And Matt, have you ever had to take a pause on a podcast and, reconnect, recollect your thoughts there for a little bit?
Not really, and I probably wish that I had, but it's an odd thing that if somebody asks my opinion, it's a courtesy to actually give it to them. I don't think I'm right. I don't think I have the answers. I don't think I have any sort of greater wisdom than anybody else. I've got a little bit more experience in some areas, particularly of the industry, because you hear a lot. But if somebody asks you a question, what do you think about this? Giving them the answer that they want to hear seems to be very disrespectful. So, I'm quite willing to be unfiltered, and sometimes I get accused of being unfiltered, but to me it's paying them the respect of telling you what I think, because that's what you've asked.
Similarly to a lot of publications around Australia who do beer reviews, but every beer is perfect all the time. I don't see the value in reviewing 100 beers and everyone's 5 out of 5, because when you go and judge beer competitions, not every beer is 5 out of 5. Certainly some beers are better than others, and I'm very surprised when that we have beer reviewers reviewing every single beer perfectly all the time.
Well, and look, I agree with you there. And look, we don't review beers on Brews News for a whole host of reasons. It would probably be like a whole other question. But if anybody, like James knows that every now and then, rather than post to Facebook some public rant saying, why is this being done? Like James knows that every now and then I'll sort of send him a text and just to say, say, this is what I think. And it doesn't have to be public.
Yeah.
But it's a courtesy. One of the nicest things, and I'm not sure if he's watching, but James Atkinson, who edited Brews News for a while, and I think he's one of the great beer writers, one of the great drinks writers in the country. When he first started, when I first spoke to him about coming to write for me, he said, I didn't think you liked me. I said, why? He goes, you're always sending me these messages where you're disagreeing with me. And that, again, is because, and they were all private, whatever, because you don't have to do it publicly. And that's where a lot of the great conversations take place, is offline, because everything doesn't have to be held in public just because we have social media.
Yeah, and I think that's been one of the big changes, even in the 10 years that we've been doing it, Matt, is the growth of social media and the growth of people, everyone wanting to have an opinion. I do like to think, other than on occasion, I don't think either Brews News or Crafty Pint are opinion sites. Like, they are actually news or information, that we're there to, relay what's going on. And if the occasion demands it, then we'll, go a bit deeper, or we'll put some commentary on there. And when it comes to the beer write-ups, we've been very much talk about the beer. Like, is there a story behind it? Tell the story, entertain people, describe what it is. If it's faulty, tell me and I'll ring the brewer. I won't name names, but there's someone who's got a pretty good reputation in the beer industry at the minute. Sent me some samples of a beer recently, and I was like, that's not right. Got in touch, got sent a fresh batch. I'm like, it's not right. I was like, I just won't write about it. I'll give you my honest feedback, but there's nothing to be gained from me saying on my website what this is like, or going in public to say this isn't right. Whereas hopefully you can gain from personal, and that's what we've always done at Crafty Pint. So, a lot of, I have to be honest, a lot of beers that are coming our way now, and I'm sure you find it, the standard really has improved. And you still get some standout beers, but the things that stand out more now are when you get a beer that isn't good, because but that's the approach I've always taken. If I get a new writer coming on writing about beers and I see words like perfect and ideal, I'll just go back to them and say, was this really perfect? Describe what it is, and if you enjoy the beer, that's fine. But there's probably only half a dozen beers you have in any given year where you have it and go, that is perfect, So, for me, I'd rather have that sort of levity and I know there's some beers, like coming back to the pastry stouts, I have some pastry stouts and, other styles of beer and go, I don't really like this, but it's not faulty. So I'm just going to tell the story and describe what it is. And if you think it's your thing, go for it, because someone's going to love it.
And
it's
that's
not
the
up to
same
me.
with Flanders Reds. I think it's a bit like pastry stouts. You either appreciate what the brewers tried to do there, or you don't, and don't try and make it out to be something that it's not. And I think that's
nothing like a pastry stout.
We've got a few questions we might jump into. Justin's put a comment up there saying there's obviously been a lot more focus on local beer, and do we feel that that's going to be a continued thing now? And what about breweries who didn't have a local focus but now do? Are they going to stick with that local focus, or once we all get out of this in 2 years' time, are they all going to jump back into their old business model? What are you guys thinking there? For me personally, I think local's always been it's been first and foremost for us since we started Ben Spoke. It was always about starting in a brew pub and having a local, a local clientele, or a local local patrons coming in and appreciating what we do and respecting that we've had a go locally, and knowing that the beer's made just over the bar, and the glass of beer that they've been poured's a couple of weeks old. It's super fresh, and we're connecting with the community. We're employing people. That was something I learnt working in a brew pub at the Wigan Pen, was the amount of local support we had, and that was something that was very easy to make a decision on when we were setting up Ben Spoke. That's what we wanted to do. We've sort of achieved a fair bit of that with a great local support and great local following. But I know there's a lot of breweries out there who aren't lucky enough to have that, aren't lucky enough to have something like that they can fall back on. They've had to pivot and try and create that. Now that they have, do you think they'll keep the local following, or will they focus back on, national distribution or export? Maybe Matt, you've got a comment there.
Oh, mate, I think you're spot on. There are two models, and if you're not local, you're going to be big, and if you're going to be big, you want to be big, because you're just going to be crashing up against, you're going to be crashing up against the big guys. And if you look at what's happening internationally, we saw New Belgium, for example. Sierra Nevada is growing at 1% or 2%. The big craft breweries internationally, there almost seems to be a glass ceiling that unless your trajectory takes you, into orbit, you're just going to reach a level and find it very, very hard to break through. And, I remember having conversations with brewers, 300-400 breweries ago, when you'd sort of say, well, can Australia cope with 301 breweries? And they go, oh, yeah, Australia can cope with 301 breweries, which is great until you're number 301 of 650. You might have done your calculations on being the 300th brewery, but that doesn't stop the 400 breweries in planning. And if you aren't local, if you don't have a local presence at your heart, and local can be a lot of different things. It doesn't have to be your neighbourhood. It has to be something. I think that there are going to be a lot of breweries that struggle. Again, like you guys at Benspoke are very, very strongly Canberra, but you've got a national presence. But if people think of you, they don't think of you as being a national brewery. And I just sort of think that that's such a smart way to go.
I think the interesting words you used there was heart. Like, I don't think you can create a local presence. Like, it's just like you can't fake a story in craft beer. Like, most people, the people that are really engaged, who are the ones that you want to become your word of mouth advocates or whatever, they see through the bullshit, I think, and they know when something's true. And it's probably one of the things I've said most often to brewers over the years from what I've seen is, if you've got a story, and God love, I hope you've got a story in craft beer, be your story and live your story and tell your story, and then that comes down to the local thing. If that isn't part of your story, it's very hard to then create it, because it's not something that's authentic or genuine. But coming back to the local thing, I think it's sort of been happening over the years anyway. If you think about 6, 8, 10 years ago, everyone was raving about oxidized IPAs coming in from overseas, because even maybe oxidized are probably still better or more interesting or bigger than all of the stuff locally. Yeah. But now you've got so many people making great fresh IPAs, sours, whatever it is. There's some fantastic barrel aging programs going on. We're blessed with some really good beer. So even if you're uber nerd who only wants to chase like the finest beers, you're going to find plenty to satisfy you over here now. So I think there has been, to an extent, less looking overseas. There's still, there's sort of the very small sort of importers like Forward Hops, Fleet Wings, that bring in tiny batches, a couple of pallets or a container full from some massively hyped tiny breweries in Maine or whatever. They sell them to Carwyn Cellars and a few other places, and the absolute niche of the niche of the niche come along and have a great time and spend a ton of money on those beers. But that's kind of almost become, from my perspective, the import trade more than bringing in overseas breweries that you think are actually going to gain traction and become sustainable. So I think there's already been that move towards supporting local, in part because there's more breweries, there's more awareness, and because there's better beer. And I think what's happened over the last few months with this support local, whether it's cafes, bakeries, whatever, is that it's just sort of intensified that and maybe made it even more hyper-local, so that, you probably will look to pick up a 6 or a pack or a case from, your local brewery every now and then. You might still want to pick up your bent spoke that you love, but you're still going to go, I'm going to support the guys around the corner as well, and I hope it stays. I really hope it becomes one of those things that outlasts the pandemic, that people go, I made a connection with the guy 2Ks up the road. They personally delivered me those 2 cases of beer and put a love heart on the box and said thanks for the support or whatever. You hope that those little things outlast, however long this thing goes on for.
But I think if we dive into this a little bit, this has been the beer culture of a lot of places overseas. So overseas, certainly in Europe and the UK, local has always been a given. It's local breweries in the UK, certainly in Europe, they have local support as a given. Like, if you live in a town, you drink that local beer. You don't even consider anything else coming in. So I think in some ways Australia's catching up a little bit there with that local part, because when I've done my beer trips overseas, it's pretty obvious that if you walk into a brasserie or a pub in the UK or a beer hall in Germany, there are too many options. You're not going to have if you're down the south of England, you're not going to have hand pump real ales from up the north and vice versa. I mean, occasionally you do now, but generally you would drink the ones that are brewed locally. I mean, I think is that showing a little bit of immaturity, maybe a little bit of mature growth in the Australian brewing industry, do you think?
Oh, there's maybe sort of two tiers to it. There's almost becoming a homogenized global craft beer world because everyone is almost more connected now. So, when some trend comes out like Brut IPA, within a few months, everyone's kind of in every reasonably developed craft beer cultures making them. So there's a bit of that sort of global homogenization. But I do think, the rise of brew pubs, even if a lot of them are making similar beers, I think what's maybe bringing people to them is the locality, and is if there's a vibe there, and if the people are local, and it's somewhere they can come to and have that community feel, So I think it's almost like two separate things. There are people out there who are all making the same craft beers, and Strata's landing in every craft beer community at the same time, and suddenly everyone's making a Strata IPA, or everyone's chasing Sabro or whatever. There's kind of that, and then there's the local thing, which is probably more community and vibe based, and then there's the specialists like your Wildflower or that kind of thing, where they've got something even more sort of localized and unique. But I guess there wasn't an option to have a local brewery in Australia for nearly 100 years, really, maybe more than 100 years. Everything sort of collapsed at the start of the 20th century. And now we're getting to the point where you can go to Cairns and pick from 4 or 5 breweries, or you can go to, a lot of regional towns and there's a brewery there. So,
yeah, that's right. A lot of history, I think, overseas, and I think if we, that's something that I certainly learnt when I went overseas and went to some, great beer destinations, was the history, and that you had to take that on board when you're trying to start out and do your own thing and learn what they've already learned for hundreds of years. And I think being local is has been a big part of us, and we continue that. It's one of our big focuses. I guess got a couple more questions. They're firing in now. Keep them firing in, by the way. You're going to win lots of good stuff, and don't forget that big beer experience at the end of the season when we give out our best question winner. But I'm going to put you guys on the spot here. Justin's put in.
Is anyone apart from Justin asking questions?
Justin. Yeah. Well, actually, we'll go to Peter then, and Peter says, "What have you each at all time? What are your each all-time favourite beers?" And I'm going to put / beer experiences in there. What do you count as some of the best times, or some of those best beers you've had? I mean, we're all getting a little bit old. We've all got lots of storage now, but can you pull out 2 good ones? Matt, maybe you lead out there.
Mate, James and I are both really lucky in that we get invited to places and we get to do things. So, I've got a private tour of Weinstefana and got to go to Leafman's Brewery and these amazing experiences. So I'll give you the 2 things in my beer journey that really sum up a lot of my approach to the beer. One of them is my first hop harvest in Tasmania, where I got to go down and visit the hop harvest. It was Cascade First Harvest. They were doing it, and first time I ever walked into a hop field. And you hear brewers talk about beer being an agricultural product and these things, but you stand in a hop field and you look at everything that goes on there, and you suddenly realise these are going into my beer. And that was a completely foundational, experience of mine. And then the other one, and it's potential a point of shame, but one of my top beer experiences was a day after a group of friends of mine and I, and it was after I'd been writing about beer. We were fly fishing for barramundi north of Cairns, didn't catch a single thing. It was 42 degrees and about 130% humidity. And we'd spent a day for no achievement, got back to Port Douglas, and the only beer that we could get was a $20 bucket of Coronas. And it was one of the best beers that I had. And it had nothing to do with the liquid. It had nothing to do, like I wanted to hate it. I would have had just about anything else, but all we could get was Corona. And it constantly reminds me that we drink for the experience of sharing, and all of the things that make a beer great often has nothing to do with what's in the liquid.
So what? There wasn't a good wine or a good Bacardi Breezer on the menu. You dipped into the Coronas.
Mate, it was cold and it was wet, and I was with friends, and it wasn't about the liquid. It was about the moment. And to be honest, like I don't even remember the taste of the beer. I remember being with the people. And it was beer. And, like I would much have rather had it been an independent craft beer from a brewer that I knew. But it was the experience. And, ultimately, if you think about why we drink, one of the reasons I got into beer was because wine was so incredibly wanky. And I've always hated the thought of beer becoming that, because ultimately we don't need to drink beer. It doesn't keep us alive. We've got clean water. We've got all these things. But it's the pleasure that it brings us. And that pleasure can come from so many ways. But I've never had a beer that was more social. I never had a drink that was more social and brought people together the way that beer does. And it can be a Corona, or it can be, like a Flemish barrel-aged, sour ale. And it can do it. And I just don't think wine has that same ability. So, yes, it was a Corona, but it was just one of those things that really reminded me why beer is just such a valuable part of our lives.
And James?
Yeah, I think beer-wise, I think when we started doing bios on Crafty, I sort of listed 7 or 8 that I realised were sort of, important beers along the journey. But the thing that really sticks out for me, like you say, Matt, we do get all these incredible experiences. Like in the early days of Stone and Wood, the first time Mum and Dad came out to visit us in Australia, when my daughter was, or maybe the second time, my daughter was only just a few weeks old. We went, in Byron Bay, and just standing on the brew deck when they had just a little brewery, and there's my mum and dad and Tara with this baby strapped to her. We're drinking Pacific Ale from the tanks. Like, we get to do these things because we're just around the industry. But you were talking about sort of going overseas and the history, and it's something that I guess we're starting to create now. A new generation of history in Australia. But maybe 3 or 4 years ago, when I was back in the UK, I went to Belgium, and I think I was there for 72 and a half hours. That was it. Because when you go back to the UK, it's focused on seeing family. And my dad joined me after the first night. And the first place we went to after he pulled into the Eurostar station, we went straight to Cantillon. And I'd already spent the previous afternoon with Yves at Brasserie de la Senna, trying all his beers, which was fantastic. So I went to Cantillon, did the tour, and I think the guys at Phoenix had put a word in advance, but we didn't sort of know too much. And then Jean Van Roy just came and joined me and my dad at the table. My dad had never had a sour beer in his life, so his first ever sour beer was at Cantillon. And then John came over and started pulling stuff out. And because my dad was there, who's been in sales and marketing, and worked in the woodworking and engineering industry, the questions he was asking him were not the sort of questions that would ever normally be asked of this guy. And so the experience was just completely different to any that we you'd normally have if you're there with beer nerds. Or just your beer mates. Then we went on to Struss, and again he sat down with Urban, and Urban had no interest in me. He was interested in the 67-year-old guy who'd never tried. And he started pulling out these unreleased spirits he'd made, and just goes, "Look, you go and look after yourself with the taps, mate. I'm talking to your dad." And then we went and had the tour of Rodenbach, and because I'd met Philip when he came over here to do this event, and we got the whole tour of Rodenbach, and he showed us the tour plus, and he showed us the room where they rebuild all the footers. And so my dad was like, "Which machines do you have? What do you use in here?" And then when we got to the end, Rudy, and it was just this beautiful thing where on the one side it was me having this experience with my dad, which made it very special and very different to if I'd been there with on my own or with other beer people. But also every place we went to was just unique. and there was history dripping from the walls, and it was so almost overwhelming just how incredible. You can understand why people are inspired by by visits to Germany or to the UK, to Belgium or whatever, and you can see why Belgium has beer so much at its heart, because everywhere we went was just phenomenal and romantic, and the beers were incredible. And I don't know, it was I had this. I came away after the 72 and a half hours or whatever it was. I was like, you could give me 7 weeks in America touring all the best breweries, and I don't think I could get as much enjoyment or as many experiences as I got in those 3 days. It was just phenomenal. Really, just absolute standout experience.
Yeah, great. I think we all share the same things, because certainly I remember when John's mum told Tracy not to leave her bag lying around on the ground because people would steal it, and it took about 15 minutes for Sean's mum to explain to Tracy in French what she was trying to tell her. But that was one of the beauties of going to Cantillon and meeting Sean and his mum and dad, actually, who were there at the time.
Yes.
So yeah, I guess moving forward, we've got a couple of questions. We're going back to the old seltzer, and we did all mention Stone and Wood and the pioneers of craft beer in Australia. Probably, certainly, the biggest brewer in Australia in terms of craft beer, but they've just put out a seltzer themselves. Certainly, maybe not under the Stone and Wood brand, but certainly in the same company structure. So they obviously are seeing something that's happening. Or they obviously had a few kegs that they can't sell at the moment. But has anyone got what is a really good seltzer at the moment? I actually haven't tried any Australian seltzers. I certainly had them overseas, and I found them, I think I found them intermittent would be the best word. They'd all be up and down. They'd be super sweet.
I found this one goes pretty well. The Descent 20 is a pretty decent one. There we are, the Sunley, yeah.
This is my first taste.
My experience with them is very limited. I've tried the ones from Hop Nation, the Rays, and they're very sort of fruit forward in that sort of sweet sort of fruit character, and then I've had the ones from St Andrews, which are very much there's the
Matt, that looks like soda water. That looks like straight soda water. Matt's going to do a live tasting on air of the Stone and Wood seltzer.
Ginger and lemon.
Talk us through it.
Well, it smells like lemongrass. Like it's got a ginger and lemon sort of aroma, and you can sort of see the look of it there. The very slightly cloudy. So it's a hazy.
The Hazy Boy Seltzer crew.
Look, I think if I sum up this, I think Brad Rogers has moved from an awesome brewer into an awesome business owner, and I still think he would be scratching the back of his neck at this particular one coming out, although he'd be very supportive of it.
So who was that?
That was Brad Rogers.
Oh, yeah.
Ross, another owner, another founding owner, would be fully supportive of it because he's all about sales. Jamie, probably coming from the marketing side of things, I think he would be very supportive, but at the same time would be questioning the direction the company's going. Head brewer in Keelan, I'm not sure he's looking to free up too many more tank spaces, but maybe I'll have a chat to him. But Matt, what are you getting there?
At the same time, with those, since they launched Fermentum, you've got the part ownership with Buka, the Buka Byron, and it's allowed them to do fixation, without attaching that to Stone and Wood. Although I think I have Tommy saved in my phone as Tom Belmont's Stone and Wood IPA. And then obviously Brad's had his side project with Forest for the Trees. So, this is I guess a further leap from, what their core offering has been. And it's, it is one that they want to stand on its own, that they don't want it to be seen as Stone and Wood suddenly. They want it to be seen as, this is a new brand.
No, I hear that, but I think you'd have to say that there'd be something on the can that says Stone and Wood. So, I appreciate the great impact that they've had on the beer market, and it's insurmountable what they've contributed. I mean, they were pioneers in terms of getting a national brand out around and inspired so many people to set up breweries, drink craft beer, and good luck to them. If this is where we see beer going, then maybe in 2 years' time, Ben Spoke might have a some sort of hop forward seltzer. But we'll
just on that note though, do you think it will? I mean, it's been insane in America, but America is a very different place, as as we're seeing day in, day out, week in, week out. It is a very different place in many ways to Australia. It's a bigger market. Do we think that seltzer is going to rise to take that? Because all this talk years ago about cider. Cider's going to come in on the back of record legs, rapid growth early on, and then ginger beer. And yet, to be honest, craft beer has proven pretty resilient, or craft style beers, I guess, if you include the ones that are made by big beer or have been acquired. Like it has just kept on growing. And as far as I can tell, craft style beer is, whether they're independent or not, are still growing and have proven actually pretty resilient to everything else out there. And there's probably also still enough of a market to grow into. In that, in the UK, real ale was at 35% of the market before craft beer started. And I think that made it harder for craft beer to nudge its way in first, because people who didn't want industrial lager already had real ale to go to. In America, the market's bigger already. When craft beer was coming in here, there was nothing else apart from Cooper's. There was Cooper's, wine, and lager. And so we had almost a freer run. So I'm still not convinced that seltzer is going to go nuts in the same way here. I'm sure it will find a market, but whether it goes to the same degree.
We are comparing different markets, though. I mean, you talk about real ale in the UK, but UK's now got the most breweries per capita, funnily enough. So, I mean, that maybe was a really great foundation for craft beer to actually, really kick off in the future, because the drinking population over there was already, accustomed to trying different beers. I know that a lot of the breweries in the UK got taken over by big European lager producers, and there was a massive lager influence over there. But I think that's come back now. Like there's a massive resurrection of the brewing industry in the UK, and people actually brewing ales. The US, I don't know. I can't read the US. All I'm going to say there is that they eat a hell of a lot more junk food than Australia. So seltzer maybe
these are healthy, mate. These are healthy.
Yeah, maybe not. Well, are they? I suppose
they're playing to a healthy lifestyle. They are inspired by the healthy lifestyle that we all want to get.
It's the Smooth FM mid-morning show of alcohol.
Rich, I'm with you. Again, trying it. It is. There's nothing to dislike about it, but there's nothing that. I don't know that anyone is going to try that and go, this is what I want to spend my life doing. The way that craft beer, no one ever tried a Corona. Going back to my, it was a moment that I remember, but no one had that Corona going, I'm going to leave my corporate job and make that for a living, because it's not inspirational.
I had that amazing sour beer experience with my dad and Jean Van Roy, but then I had a seltzer that just fucking beat everything.
So on one hand, there's that. It's never inspired anybody to, take a mortgage on their house and open a brewery. But at the same time, the guys behind Stone and Wood have got 170 staff now. They've kept them all on through COVID. The amount of risk that they took on, and they're going on. And this is a way of broadening their appeal and securing their business. And I'll never, ever criticise them for doing that.
No, I'm not criticising them either. I'm just, I guess they're a brewing company, and, have meant so much to our industry in terms of paving the way for so many other breweries to open up. And not that they will, but I was a little bit surprised at the seltzer coming out, but I fully support and understand it. I guess we've got a couple more questions. One for me, the Wheelie Juicy in the brew pub, was there any purees adjuncts used? We definitely used some passion fruit and mango in that to make it fruity and juicy. I think that was just one of our beers that we were beer styles we were trying to have a go at, and I'm pretty keen on getting into the brew pub and drinking a pint of that pretty soon. It tastes pretty good. I guess a question for you guys, we always get asked this, what's a small brewery and what's a large brewery? What does that mean now? I mean, it was pretty easy when I started. There were 6 small breweries and 3 big breweries. We've come a long way since then, and now we've got 650 breweries. How do we classify breweries, and should we classify them, or what should we do? James, maybe have a go first.
Oh no, well, I guess if you look at, say, awards, when they've tried to sort of work out where the level should be for who's a large champion brewery and who's a medium champion brewery, moves around a lot every year, and it's often different from competition to competition. You look at something, say, like the IBA, trying to work out where their membership fee should lie, and the definitions there. Definitions are always very hard, I think, in beer. Like, I'm very keen to read talking beer writers. Pete Brown, I love his writing. He's got a new book coming out this week that he's written during isolation, and it's basically, I think the précis is something like craft, impossible to define, something like that. But it's utterly essential. And I think craft, it's another one of those things about. I mean, you could draw a clear line and say a big brewery is a multinational beer company and all the brands within them, and small is everyone else aside from that, and that might be the cleanest way to do it. Because everyone said independence is clearer, but they feel like, well, what, and I guess the independence can be in if you're not owned by another beer or beverage company. But what is your ownership if you're owned and have unlimited funds available to you from a hedge fund or an investment fund? But even with with craft, it always came down to me. Everyone's understanding of craft is different. Everyone's values are different. So I don't know whether definition matters so much. For me, as a journalist or a writer, I think the important thing is just to put the facts on the table and to, tell the stories in the best way you can and let people make their opinions, because people are going to form an opinion on something, and they're going to bring different preconceptions to the table, and they will all be happy with some things and not happy with others, and like when we come to the beer write-ups on Crafty Pint on a very base level, we might not like that beer, but there's nothing wrong with it. Just describe it, because someone else is going to think it's the greatest beer ever. And I think, from my point of view, you just put the information out there and say, this is who these people are, this is what they do. Up to you to make your judgment. And
Matt, what do you?
Mate, can I be honest? I don't care. Like, Cooper's is a third of the size of Sierra Nevada. Size doesn't matter. And then it comes down to how do you look into the heart of the brewer? Because that's ultimately, all of these definitions are about looking into the heart of the brewer. And, for me, if the big brewers, now that they own the Bolters and the Four Pines and the Pirate Lifes and things, if they were making the beers in 1995 that they're making now, we wouldn't have had a craft beer revolution. We wouldn't have had a reason to fire up. But they're only doing that because small brewers created the demand and showed them, they had to be dragged kicking and screaming to make those beers and buy the brands that gave them that size. So, if you want to look into the heart of a brewer, drink their beers. And find a little bit about them, depending on your interest, and support the brewers that are going to keep the industry as wonderfully vibrant as it is. So it doesn't matter their size, it doesn't matter how local they are, it matters how they make their beer and how they resonate with their community, and that is what's going to keep beer as exciting as it is.
Yeah, I think there's similar. When we were doing the Keeping Local, or starting the Keeping Local Live campaign, aside from keeping any crafty branding off it, because we wanted it to be something that could be owned by the industry or whatever, there was discussion about, there was some discussion about maybe tweaking the message, and I wanted to keep independence away from it. We were entering this sort of epochal disaster for the industry, and local just seemed like a nice term for
Yeah.
like keeping your local community alive. And I didn't want to sort of say, oh, well, Bolter can't get behind it or Ferrell can't get behind this message because they're owned by someone else. Like, they're still employing staff who live local. They're still going to employ venues that need to survive. And if those people can help amplify the message, so it's I don't know, it's a tough one. I think, we all have opinions on what we believe in and what we would love to see in a utopian world. But at the same time, I think, as individuals and certainly as journalists, your responsibility is almost to try and take yourself out of that and be objective and just, like you say about getting to know the heart of a brewer through their beer or their story. Like, that's very important. And that's why, going back to what I said before about brewers have a story. If it's a genuine story, that is your story, and people will love you or not love you because of that story, and yeah.
And we're getting towards the end here, hour and 20 minutes, one of our longest shows. So let's let's ask you guys, what's the future look like for talking about beer, not writing? Matt, do you want to have a stab at that one?
In terms of beer communication, beer journalism?
Yeah. What's the future look like for you guys? I mean, you've transitioned from writing to now talking to, more digital content. Is that where it's all going to go, or are we going to swing back to potential old school, or what are you thinking? And how do breweries best? And from Sarah, our local beer expert, how do breweries best tell their story as well?
Oh, that's easy. Sack your public relations person who's charging you $600, $700, $800 a month to send Craft NI the media releases that if you just picked up the phone and told us, we would write anyway. Take a classified on a directory listing on Crafty, which is 1 month of that. Take a subscription to Brews News, which is the other month, and then get a really good chalkboard artist to change the artwork out on the street. You'll get much better than you'll get from public relations and things like that. And because beer journalism is a microcosm of journalism generally, and James talked about it. The situation is dire for journalism. Good journalism takes time, it takes experience. It's not a social media post that reflects exactly what you want. The beer industry benefits from having people analysing it and having conversations about it. And, if you just ask, well, am I going to get a response to my public relations, media release? You're basically saying, there are 700 breweries that have all got their own stories, and it just becomes confetti on social media, and none of that advances the conversation, and it just becomes noise. And it's one of the mottos that we've... Sorry, James?
Very briefly, is just with the whole colonial thing and Black Hearts, it became a non-story that became so big. If you look at pretty much all the commentary or coverage within beer media, it was responsible. It was treating the issue as it was, and then when the issue became something else, it was commenting on what had come. We all took different approaches to it, but we saw it for what it was, and we treated it the right way. And it was all the other media around that created the furore that didn't need to be there, and that's, we can't stop that fury from happening, but we can at least try and sort of be that voice of reason within there, because I guess we have an interest in that, we love it, and we're involved in this industry, but also we know it as well, and we know that, more about it. Sorry, Matt, I just...
no. Look, I was well and truly on the rant. So
we might just cover off some final questions. Seltzer, is somewhat popular due to media coverage? Answer yes. What is the worst beer description you've ever read? Somebody once wrote on one of my beers that came back from a judging. It smells like the toilet brush flick. So that is the flick of liquid when you've used your toilet. Yeah,
oh, really?
Yeah, great. That's a great description. Yeah. And funnily enough, that beer got a silver medal because 6 other judges loved it. How to Brewers, we've done that one. If a friend asks for a great beer recommendation of a new beer, which I think we've already done, what's the optimal temperature to drink? Descent 20, the temperature that suits you best. Rich, when will you build a cool ship in the brewery? I won't build a cool ship. I'll build a cool ship. It's spelled Koelschch. Yep. Thanks, James. Yes, we will build one in the next 3 years. Absolutely. And thanks, guys, for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. The last little parting thing is that we're going to write a book together called All Beer is Crafted. You guys can be the editors, and I'll contribute some little bit. I think it'll be a hit. So let's do that. Next week on the show, we're going to go down to Melbourne. We're going to go and get a tour through Two Birds Brewery and speak to Jane Lewis. She's a pioneer of Australian craft beer, and also potentially has an alternative to seltzer. So let's talk to her next week. Thanks for everyone who tuned in. Sorry it was a bit long. Hope you had a lot of beers. Cheers.
Thanks for having us on.